The biting wind whipped through the skeletal trees surrounding Ashworth Manor, their branches scratching against the decaying stone walls like skeletal fingers. It was precisely 10 minutes past midnight, on the night of December the 21st, 1999, when I, a paranormal investigator by the name of Amelia Reyes, first stepped onto the grounds. For months, I had been plagued by recurring dreams of this place, a monstrous clock tower, spiraling staircases that led nowhere, and a maze of gears that seemed to grind against my very soul. The whispers of a family driven to madness and a house that seemed to breathe with a dark, unsettling life of its own had drawn me here like a moth to a flame. Ashworth Manor was said to be a nexus point, a place where the veil between worlds was thin, and I had decided to uncover its secrets, even if it cost me my sanity. The manor loomed before me, an imposing structure of Gothic architecture, its darkened windows like empty eyes staring into my soul, reflecting the stormy sky above. The air was thick with a metallic tang. The scent of old blood and ozone, and the ever-present smell of decay permeated the grounds, a nauseating mix of mold, damp earth, and something else, something ancient and unsettling, like burnt parchment and old iron. The wrought iron gates creaked open as if welcoming me, the sound echoing through the silence, a chilling serenade that sent shivers down my spine. I pulled my flashlight from my bag, its beam cutting through the oppressive darkness, and started towards the mansion, the weight of anticipation heavy on my chest. My research had led me to believe that the manor was built in the late 18th century by the eccentric clockmaker Elias Ashworth, a man obsessed with time and its manipulation. He was also a recluse, rarely seen in town, and his wife and children had died under suspicious circumstances, their deaths shrouded in mystery and fear. Over the years, the manor had passed through several hands, each one falling victim to a tragic fate, turning the place into a hotbed for paranormal activity. It was said that Elias, in his obsession with time, had created a device, a clockwork labyrinth, that was capable of bending reality, a contraption of gears and springs that had developed a consciousness of its own. The main doors of the manor were ajar, as if inviting me inside, the wood rotten and warped, giving way with a sickening groan as I pushed it open. The interior of the house was just as dilapidated as its exterior, the furniture covered in dust sheets that seemed to move on their own in the breeze, the walls peeling and cracked, revealing strange symbols etched beneath the paint. The air was heavy and still, the silence broken only by the sound of my own breathing and a faint, rhythmic ticking that seemed to come from the depths of the house. As I stepped further inside, I noticed that the walls were lined with clocks, hundreds of them, each one frozen at a different time, their faces cracked and distorted, their hands pointing at impossible angles. The tick-tock of clocks, muted and rhythmic at first, started to surround me, growing louder with each step, as if the house itself was breathing, its heart a complex and sinister mechanism. My flashlight beam danced across a large, ornate grandfather clock that stood in the center of the entrance hall. It was easily over 10 feet tall, with intricate carvings of grotesque figures, skeletal faces, writhing serpents, and winged demons, and symbols that I couldn't identify, their eyes following me as I moved. Its pendulum swung slowly and rhythmically, a hypnotic motion that seemed to draw me in, its sound a low and ominous thrum that resonated deep within my bones. The clock's face was cracked and spiderwebbed, but the numerals were still visible, glowing faintly as if illuminated from within, a sickly green luminescence that sent shivers down my spine. As I watched, the minute hand of the clock shuddered, moving backwards by a second before stopping again, then twitching forward, as if the time itself was not stable, a chaotic dance that defied all logic. I could feel the pull, the magnetic force of the clock, trying to draw me into its depths. I decided to explore the main floor first, my hand trembling as I gripped the flashlight, the feeling of being watched growing stronger. The library was filled with countless books, all of them covered in a thick layer of dust, their spines worn and faded. The titles were a mix of occult texts, scientific treatises, and philosophical works, all of them written in different languages, some of them in ancient scripts that seemed to writhe on the page. I carefully picked one from the shelf, my fingers brushing against its cold, leather cover. It was a leather-bound volume titled Chronos Embrace, and it was written in a language I did not recognize, the letters twisting and turning like snakes. As I opened the book, the pages seemed to shimmer and change, the words rearranging themselves into different patterns, forming terrifying images and symbols, as if the book itself was alive and not stable, attempting to communicate something to me. I quickly shut the book and put it back on the shelf, feeling the blood drain from my face. In the dining room, I found a long, wooden table set for a feast, with dusty plates, silverware tarnished and corroded, and goblets half filled with dried, black liquid. The chairs were pulled out as if someone had just left the table in a hurry, their shadows stretching long and distorted across the floor. There were no signs of a party or meal, just a table set up as if for a very formal dinner. A macabre tableau frozen in time, the air thick with the smell of decaying food and a heavy silence that felt suffocating. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt as if I was being watched by unseen eyes, their presence heavy and palpable. I quickly moved on, my heart pounding in my chest, afraid of what I might see. The drawing room was filled with more clocks, each one unique and bizarre, their intricate mechanisms ticking and whirring in discordant rhythms, creating a cacophony of noise that grated on my nerves. Some of them were cuckoo clocks, but the cuckoos were replaced with grotesque figures of skeletal birds, devils with glowing eyes, and twisted humanoid creatures, their movements jerky and unsettling. I tried not to look at them, but their gaze seemed to follow me, their presence a silent and menacing threat. In the center of the room, I found a music box, its surface cold to the touch. It was a small, black box made of wood and intricate metallic details, its surface engraved with strange symbols that seemed to shift and writhe as I looked at them. As I picked it up, a melody started to play, a haunting and melancholic tune that seemed to echo through the room, its notes twisting and turning, pulling at my emotions. It was strangely hypnotic, its sound both beautiful and unsettling, pulling me deeper into the manor's sinister embrace. As I made my way to the second floor, I noticed the strange humming that was growing louder, the sound of ticking clocks now more insistent and frantic, the floorboards creaking and groaning beneath my feet as if the house itself was alive and restless. The second floor was lined with bedrooms, all of them seemingly untouched by time, the furniture still in place, the beds were made with faded sheets, and there were personal belongings scattered around each room, clothes, books, toys, letters, all of them left as if the inhabitants had just stepped out and would return any minute. It was like the house was preserving everything, refusing to let time move on, a macabre museum of a lifelong past. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to lengthen and twist, taking on sinister shapes that made my heart race. I entered one of the bedrooms, and it was a child's room, the walls decorated with childish drawings, grotesque figures and strange symbols that made me shudder. There were toys scattered across the floor, a wooden horse with broken legs, a collection of dolls with chipped porcelain faces and empty eyes, and a small music box that played a haunting, distorted melody. The room had a strange feeling, like it was frozen in time, waiting for the child to return, a chilling testament to a childhood lost to darkness. On a small table, I found a doll, its porcelain face staring up at me with empty eyes, its lips curved into a cruel, knowing smile, a disturbing image that made me want to scream. I tried not to dwell on the thought that this child was now probably dead for years, their spirit trapped within the confines of this haunted place. In the next room, I found a study, the air thick with the smell of ink and old paper. It was filled with maps, charts, and diagrams, all of them relating to time and its manipulation, their lines and symbols twisting and turning, creating a disorienting pattern. In the center of the room, there was a large desk, cluttered with papers, notebooks, and various tools, all covered in dust, as if the owner had just been interrupted in the middle of his work. On the desk, I found a diary, its leather cover worn and cracked, its pages filled with spidery handwriting. It was the diary of Elias Ashworth, his descent into madness documented in meticulous detail. The first entry, dated October 15, 1788, spoke of his growing obsession with time, his belief that it was not a linear concept but something malleable and controllable, a force that could be harnessed and bent to his will. He wrote of his experiments, his attempts to capture and harness the flow of time itself, his growing fascination with the hidden dimensions of existence. He mentioned a clockwork labyrinth that he was building in the basement, something that was capable of bending reality, a gateway to another realm. He referred to it as a living clock, an entity that was growing in power and consciousness. His handwriting became more and more erratic, his thoughts more jumbled and distorted, as if he was losing his grip on reality. As I turned the pages, the entries became more disturbing, describing his descent into madness. He wrote of his wife's growing unease, her claims that she was being watched and that the house was changing, the shadows growing darker and more menacing. She had started to act strangely, becoming disoriented and paranoid. Her eyes filled with a terrified knowledge that I could not comprehend. Then there was a page written in messy, almost illegible letters. She knows. They see her. They want her. They are coming through. The next entry was the last one, written by his son, William, his handwriting shaky and desperate. He mentioned that his father had become mad, his mind broken by the labyrinth, and was now locked in the basement, his screams echoing through the house. He wrote of his mother's disappearance, swallowed whole by the shadows, and of the strange noises from below, the grinding of gears and a low, rhythmic humming that was driving him to the brink of insanity. The last phrase on the page read, "The labyrinth is alive. It's consuming us." The words scrawled across the page in a frantic, terrified hand. That entry was dated March the 11th, 1791, a date that was etched into my memory, a testament to the horrifying fate of the Ashworth family. I closed the diary, my heart pounding in my chest, the realization of what I was dealing with slowly dawning on me. I had to find that labyrinth, and I had to stop it before it was too late, before its sinister influence consumed me as well. I knew that I was not alone in the house, that something was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake, waiting to pull me into its depths. The ticking and whirring of the clocks was now deafening, the sound starting to give me a headache, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. I made my way to the basement, the stairs creaking and groaning beneath my feet, each step taking me closer to the heart of darkness. The air grew heavy and cold as I descended, the smell of decay now overpowering, a nauseating mix of mold, rust, and something else, something ancient and evil, like the scent of a forgotten tomb. The basement was a maze of narrow corridors and low-ceilinged rooms, all lined with strange mechanisms, gears, and springs, their surfaces covered in dust and grime. The air was thick with a metallic tang, the smell of oil and metal, and a strange, cloying sweetness that made my stomach churn. The walls were lined with clocks, all of them different shapes and sizes, some of them old and broken, their hands pointing in all directions, while others were new and shining, their mechanisms whirring and ticking in perfect sync, a disturbing testament to the power of the labyrinth. It felt like I was walking through the inner workings of a giant clock, the walls pulsing with a malevolent energy. The sound of ticking was now deafening, each tick seeming to echo within my own skull. In one of the rooms, I found a large, circular platform in the center of the room, surrounded by a complex network of gears, wires, and tubes, all of them pulsating with an inner light. This was the clockwork labyrinth, a mechanical construct of incredible complexity and sinister purpose, its intricate workings designed to bend time and reality to its will. The platform was made of a smooth, dark metal that seemed to absorb the light, its surface cool to the touch, and there were symbols etched into the surface that were similar to those I had seen on the grandfather clock, their lines twisting and turning like living things. The air around the platform seemed to shimmer and distort, and I felt a strange pull towards it, as if something was trying to draw me in, a magnetic force that I could not resist. The humming I had heard earlier was now incredibly intense, and I could feel it vibrating in my bones, as if the labyrinth was resonating with my very soul. As I walked closer, the platform started to rotate slowly, the gears around it whirring into motion, their surfaces gleaming with a sinister light. The symbols on the surface started to glow faintly, their lines pulsating with energy, and I felt a strange sensation, as if my sense of time was being disrupted, the past, present, and future blurring into one chaotic mess. The clocks around me started to spin backwards, their hands moving at impossible speeds, the sound of ticking turning into a cacophony of noise, a deafening roar that threatened to shatter my sanity. I reached out to touch the platform, my fingers brushing against the cold, smooth metal. And that was when the world around me started to shift and distort, the very fabric of reality unraveling before my eyes. The walls of the room started to dissolve, the corridors twisting and turning, creating impossible geometries, and the floors rising and falling, as if I was trapped within a dream. It felt as if I was trapped inside a living clock, the gears and springs moving around me, their metallic surfaces gleaming with a predatory light, the sense of space becoming more and more distorted, the normal laws of physics no longer applying. I felt disoriented and confused, as if my mind was being unraveled, my thoughts jumbled and fragmented, my sense of self dissolving into chaos. I could not tell which way was up, which way was down, the world around me a swirling vortex of distorted shapes and colors. I was moving in circles, through a labyrinth that had no exit, my mind slowly succumbing to its sinister influence. I stumbled and fell, the ground beneath me shifting and changing, like a living organism. I saw flashes of the past Elias working on his labyrinth, his face contorted into a mask of madness, his eyes burning with a fanatic light. His wife's pale face, a look of terror etched into her features as she looked at me from the shadows. His son crying as he wrote in his diary, his body emaciated and broken. It was all blurry and distorted, a chaotic jumble of images from the past and the present, their edges blurring into one single nightmare. I could feel the presence of something else, some dark entity that was using the labyrinth to reach out to the world, its power growing with each passing moment. I heard whispers, a chorus of voices that called my name, their tones both seductive and terrifying. Amelia, you cannot escape. You are part of us now. Join us in the timeless void. Become one with the machine. The air grew colder, and the shadows around me started to lengthen and take on shapes. Grotesque figures that seemed to reach out to me with long skeletal fingers, their eyes burning with an inner light. I saw distorted versions of myself, their faces gaunt and pale, their eyes burning with an unholy light, their bodies contorted and twisted in impossible positions. I felt as if I was being pulled apart, my mind and body stretched to their limits, all the while the sound of ticking clocks turning into a deafening roar, a cacophony of noise that threatened to shatter my sanity. I could feel my sense of self dissolving, like I was being absorbed into the labyrinth, becoming part of the machine, my identity slowly fading away. I fought against the pull, but it was too strong, the entity too powerful, its grasp tightening around me like a cold, unyielding hand. I was losing control of my body and my mind, my will dissolving into the chaos of the labyrinth. I tried to scream, but no sound came out, my voice trapped within the chaotic labyrinth, my vocal cords paralyzed with terror. I felt a sharp pain in my head, as if something was piercing my skull, my thoughts dissolving into fragments, and then the world went black, a vast and unending oblivion. The cacophony of ticking clocks finally fading away into silence, leaving me suspended in a timeless void. The next thing I knew, I was lying on the cold floor of the basement, the platform in front of me, now still and silent, its surface reflecting the dim light like a dark, empty pool. The room was exactly the same as it was before, the distorted images gone, the chaos of the labyrinth seemingly receded. I was breathing heavily, my body trembling, my mind still reeling from the experience, my sense of self shattered into countless fragments. I looked at my hands and there were strange marks on my skin, as if something had been trying to pull me apart, the imprints of long, skeletal fingers etched into my flesh. I stood up slowly, my head throbbing with pain, my mind still reeling from the experience. The image of the labyrinth seared into my consciousness. I knew that I could not stay here any longer. I had to get out of this place, to escape the labyrinth's grasp, to flee from the horrors I had witnessed. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the silent basement, the sounds chasing me as I fled. I ran up the stairs, through the main floor, and out the front doors of the manor, never looking back, my mind a chaotic jumble of fragmented thoughts. I didn't stop until I was safely in my car, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. As I drove away, I looked back at the manor, its dark silhouette looming against the night sky, a monstrous monument to madness and despair. The windows were all dark and empty, but for a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure standing on the second floor, its face obscured by shadows, its eyes burning with an unholy light. It was Elias Ashworth, his presence a chilling reminder of the horrors I had faced, his gaze following me as I escaped, a silent promise of a future encounter. I knew that I had not escaped unscathed, that the labyrinth had left its mark on me, that I would never be the same, my soul forever tainted by the darkness I had witnessed. I knew that the house would call to me again, and I would have to face it one day, to confront the entity that now resides within my soul. I had felt a strange pull to go back as I was driving, a magnetic force that was slowly drawing me back to its depths, the labyrinth now a part of me. I tried to focus on the road, but the sound of the clock ticking was still inside my head, a relentless rhythm that echoed through my mind, and it was getting louder with each passing moment. I looked at the clock in my car, its face cracked and distorted. It was a little past 1, and yet it showed midnight again, the hands moving backwards in a chaotic dance that defied all logic, as if time itself was broken. I wrote this all down as a warning to others, as a testament to the horrors I had faced in the clockwork labyrinth of Ashworth Manor, a desperate plea for sanity in the face of unimaginable terror. Do not seek this place out, for its darkness will consume you, leaving you shattered and broken. Do not try to unravel its secrets, for some mysteries are best left unsolved, some truths too terrifying to face. Some doors are best left unopened, some labyrinths are best left unentered. For once you step inside, you may never escape. You may become part of the machine itself, forever trapped in its relentless gears, ticking away for all eternity, lost in the timeless void. And the ticking, it never stops. It is always there, waiting. The old lighthouse keeper, Silas, found it on the 21st of June, 1963. The salt spray stung his face like 1,000 tiny needles, each a reminder of the sea's unforgiving nature. As he bent down, the wind a howling banshee tearing at his oilskins. A small wooden box, no larger than a well-worn Bible, lay half-buried amongst the jagged rocks at the base of the cliff, slick with the sea's relentless embrace, as if the waves themselves were trying to push it back into the depths. It was a peculiar thing, the dark wood unweathered, almost unervingly pristine against the backdrop of the storm-battered coast, a stark anomaly in this landscape of decay. It was a dull, midnight blue, the color of a bruised sky after a battle between the heavens and the earth, and the wood seemed to shimmer subtly, as if catching the light from an unseen source. The surface was smooth, unnaturally so, and bore no markings, no indication of its origin, save for a series of almost invisible indentations that ran along its edges, like a network of veins beneath the skin. He ran his calloused fingers over the wood, a strange chill, colder than any winter wind, running through him. It felt wrong, as though he were holding something not meant for this world, something stolen from a realm beyond the veil. The wood seemed to vibrate faintly beneath his touch, as though the box were alive. He stared at it for a long time, the wind screaming around him, the sea roaring like a caged beast, and then, with a heavy sigh, a breath that seemed to carry all the loneliness of his years, he decided to take it inside. He wasn't sure why, but he knew, deep in his bones, that it couldn't stay there. It was as if the very ground beneath it was rejecting its presence. He carried the box back to the lighthouse, the weight of it feeling strangely disproportionate to its size, as if it contained not wood and velvet, but something of immense density, something that was pulling him toward the earth. He placed it on the worn wooden table in the small kitchen, the box a jarring contrast against the simple, utilitarian furnishings, like a piece of the night itself had landed there. Hesitantly, his hands trembling as if from a deep cold, he pried open the latch, a small silver hook that yielded with a disconcerting click, a sound that echoed eerily in the oppressive quiet of the lighthouse, as if the very stones were holding their breath. It was a delicate mechanism, almost impossibly intricate for such a seemingly simple box, and the metal seemed to gleam with a faint inner light, as if it were trying to catch the eye. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded, deep crimson velvet, a color that seemed to writhe and shift in the light, was a single tarnished key. It was an old key, ornate and heavy, the type that seemed to belong to a bygone era, perhaps even a different world entirely, the metal seeming to absorb the light around it like a dark star. The metal was cold beneath his touch, unnervingly so, sending a shiver that had nothing to do with the sea breeze running down his spine, a coldness that seemed to reach deep into his soul. It was adorned with strange glyphs that he could not recognize, yet they felt strangely familiar, each one an echo of something forgotten, something buried deep within his ancestral memory. The glyphs seemed to writhe and twist like snakes, their lines shifting and moving as he watched them, and they pulsed with a faint inner light that mirrored the glow of the box itself. He spent the next few weeks fixated on the key, his mind a whirlwind of questions that seemed to have no answers, each one a thread in a tangled web of mystery. Where did the box come from? How did it appear on his beach, seemingly out of thin air, like some forgotten relic of a forgotten age? What lock did this key open, and what lay beyond it? And why had it appeared on the very day the gales had picked up speed, as if the storm itself were a messenger, and the sea's roar seemed to hold a mournful plea, a lament for something lost? The weather was foul, worse than any he could recall over the last few decades, the very air thick with a sense of foreboding. The sea crashed against the rocks with such violence that at one point he feared the lighthouse might give in to its fury, the old stone trembling beneath the relentless onslaught. But still the questions persisted, swirling in his mind like a tempest, refusing to be ignored. He tried the key in every lock he could find in the lighthouse, the ancient storage lockers where they kept spare lamp oil, their metal rusted and warped by the salt air, the rusted doors to the maintenance room where he kept his tools, his hands growing calloused and stained with grime, the metal boxes containing old documents, filled with maps of forgotten coastlines and logbooks written by men long dead, and even the padlock on the old tool shed outside, its metal eaten away by time and neglect, but to no avail. None of them were the right fit. The key wouldn't even fit inside the small padlock that held the diary he usually kept for writing notes about the lamp, a journal of his mundane existence that now seemed a million miles away. It felt like the key was mocking him, holding a secret he could not unlock, a taunt from a realm beyond human comprehension. Then, in the dead of night, during the witching hour on the 16th of July, 1963, at precisely 3 minutes after midnight, as the lamp continued its relentless sweep of the sea, its beam cutting through the darkness like a sword, he heard it. A faint, rhythmic thumping sound, a low and pulsating beat, originating from deep within the lighthouse tower, as if something were growing within the very heart of the structure. He had lived in this lighthouse his entire adult life, and he had never, not once, heard that sound before. It was a low, persistent beat, almost like a heartbeat, resonating through the aged stone of the tower, a constant drumbeat that seemed to be both within the walls and coming from them, a sound that seemed to seep into his very bones. It was a sound that burrowed deep under his skin, awakening something primal and unsettling within him, a sense of unease that was more than just fear, an ancient dread that had been sleeping for centuries. He felt a chill, despite the thick clothes he wore, a creeping sense of dread that was far worse than fear, a feeling that he was no longer alone in this place. Fear, raw and visceral, gripped him, a cold hand clutching at his heart. He was a man of logic, a man of the sea, yet his very core recoiled from the sound, as if an ancient instinct was warning him of danger. He tried to rationalize the sound, to tell himself it was just the wind shifting in the tower's structure, or perhaps a hallucination brought on by weeks of restless nights and the eerie silence that accompanied them, the oppressive solitude slowly driving him to the brink. But in his heart, he knew better. He clutched the key tightly, the cold metal a desperate comfort against his clammy palm, the only tangible thing in this surreal night. His hands were shaking, not from the cold but from a bone-deep terror, as he lit the old oil lamp, its flame flickering wildly, casting long, dancing shadows that writhed and twisted across the walls, making the very stones of the lighthouse feel as if they were closing in on him, suffocating him with their silent malevolence. He followed the sound, his senses heightened by adrenaline and dread, ascending the winding staircase that snaked its way to the lamp room. His heart pounding in his chest with every step, each beat echoing the strange rhythm coming from above. Each step creaked like a forgotten lament, the sound amplified by the silence, and the rhythm of the thumping grew louder with every level he passed, each beat resonating in his bones, a hypnotic pulse that seemed to draw him onward, against his will. It wasn't just a thumping, he realized, as the sound intensified. It was also a voice, a deep and resonant sound that spoke a language he didn't understand, yet felt deeply familiar. It was a melody, a dissonant, unnerving tune played on what seemed like a drum, but not a drum he knew, a rhythm that seemed to be the very pulse of something ancient and alien, a beat that was both alluring and terrifying. He felt an odd urge to move to the beat, to simply stop thinking and lose himself in the hypnotic rhythm, to surrender to the darkness that was calling to him. He reached the lamp room, the heart of the lighthouse, its large glass dome reflecting the moonlight and the swirling clouds above, and there, nestled amidst the intricate lens system, its brass fittings gleaming dully under the flickering light, was a sight that made his breath catch in his throat, a vision that seemed to defy logic and reason. A small wooden door he had never seen before was set into the wall and looked completely out of place, as if it had been grafted into the very fabric of the lighthouse itself. It wasn't of the same stone as the lighthouse, nor the weathered wood he knew existed within the structure, but of a dark, polished wood that seemed to absorb the light around it, almost like a black hole, an absence where something should be. It was set flush against the wall, almost invisible to the untrained eye, and would be impossible to see had you not known it was there. A secret gateway hidden in plain sight. A lock old and complicated, a complex array of intricate mechanisms that seemed to shift and move of their own accord, was situated on the door, its metal covered in the same strange glyphs as the key, and the key he had found in the box felt, finally, like it belonged. It felt like they had waited for this moment, together, for centuries, patiently waiting for their reunion. With trembling hands, his fingers numb with a mixture of fear and anticipation, he inserted the key into the lock, the metal cold against his skin, and with a satisfying click, a sound that seemed to echo in the silence of eternity, the lock opened. He pulled open the door, and a gust of cold, stale air rushed out, a wind that seemed to carry the weight of ages, carrying with it the faint scent of dust, old leather, decay, and something else, something indefinable but utterly alien, a scent that burned his nostrils and seemed to cling to him like the breath of a long-dead god. The thumping grew louder, almost deafening now, and he felt a primal urge to turn away, to flee this place of unholy intrusion into his life, to retreat to his simple, predictable world, to hide from the unknown. But curiosity, that ancient and dangerous siren, kept him rooted to the spot, a prisoner of his own desire to know the truth. He felt as though he was being watched, not by any person, but by something else entirely, an ancient presence that had been waiting for this moment. He felt the pressure of it in his very bones, a weight that was both terrifying and irresistible. He stepped through the doorway into what appeared to be a small circular chamber, the space feeling bigger on the inside than it had seemed from the outside. The walls were made of the same dark, polished wood as the door, smooth and cold to the touch, the wood seeming to absorb all the light, creating an oppressive darkness that seemed to push in on him, and the air was heavy and still, thick with a silence that pressed in on him, a silence that felt alive. There were no markings, no furniture, no source of light other than what he brought with him. The oil lamp barely piercing the gloom, its flame casting dancing shadows that twisted and distorted into grotesque shapes. In the center of the chamber, suspended in mid-air, a defiant challenge to the laws of gravity, was a large, pulsating orb of light. It was the source of the thumping, the light of an unnatural origin, flickering with the rhythm, as if alive, its surface rippling like the surface of water. The orb pulsed in time to the rhythm of the drumbeat, casting eerie, shifting shadows across the walls, creating grotesque shapes that danced in the periphery of his vision, figures that seemed to be watching him, judging him. It was a light that seemed to defy the laws of physics, a source of pure energy that should not exist, a gateway to a reality that lay beyond human comprehension. He took a hesitant step closer, drawn by an invisible force, his legs moving as if they were controlled by some unseen puppet master, and the orb pulsed brighter, the thumping intensifying, until he felt like his heart was trying to escape his chest, his pulse racing with fear and a strange sense of exhilaration. He wanted to scream, to break the oppressive silence, but the sound was trapped in his throat, a silent cry lost in the void. The walls began to vibrate, and the air started crackling with a low, dark hum, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to penetrate his very soul, a vibration that seemed to rearrange the very molecules of his being. Then, the orb emitted a sharp, piercing tone, a high-pitched sound that felt like it was drilling into his brain, and the chamber dissolved around him, the walls simply fading away like a mirage, replaced by a reality that was far more terrifying than any nightmare. He found himself in a vast, desolate landscape, a bleak and lifeless place that felt like a nightmare made real, a place where the very laws of nature seemed to have been twisted and distorted into something grotesque. The sky above was a swirling vortex of inky black and violent purples, the stars distorted and alien, like eyes staring down at him from another world, and the ground beneath his feet was a cracked, barren wasteland of ashen rock, a landscape devoid of life, of hope, of any recognizable feature, a graveyard of forgotten worlds. There was no sign of the lighthouse, no sign of the familiar coast, the sea, the land he had known for so long, as if they had never existed. He was utterly alone in this hellish place, abandoned in this nightmarish reality, with no way to tell where he was, how he had arrived there, or if he would ever escape. He tried to make sense of his new surroundings, but it was like trying to grasp smoke, each thought slipping away as soon as it formed, his mind rebelling against the sheer absurdity of what he was seeing. In the distance, beyond the shifting sands and twisted rock formations, he saw a towering structure, a colossal monolith of black stone that seemed to pierce the swirling sky, its top disappearing into the chaos above, its presence a malevolent finger pointing accusingly at him. It was the source of the drumming, he realized, the sound that had called him to this place, and it was calling to him still with an insistent, almost irresistible urgency, a siren song that promised both salvation and doom. A force pulled him, he found, against his will, a magnetic attraction to the black obelisk that felt like fate, the only constant in the vast emptiness of this place, as if his very existence was tied to its dark purpose. He had become a puppet of destiny. He had no memory of the time that passed as he made his way towards the black obelisk, his body moving of its own accord, the landscape around him blurring and distorting, as though the very fabric of reality was unraveling, revealing the madness that lay beneath. Time seemed fluid, distorted, and irrelevant, a river that had been turned back on itself. At one point, he thought he saw figures, vague, distorted shapes moving in the distance, flitting in and out of existence, their forms shifting and changing, as if they were made of smoke and shadow, but whenever he tried to focus on them, they'd flicker and disappear, as if they were not quite real, phantoms of a forgotten world. He tried to scream to them, to ask them where he was, to beg for help, but no sound came, his voice lost in the vastness of this alien landscape. He was alone, truly alone, the only living thing in this lifeless domain. He reached the base of the monolith, and the drumming stopped, the oppressive rhythm suddenly ceasing, as if it had finally reached its destination, as if it had finally claimed its prize. It was replaced by an eerie silence that pressed in on him, heavier than any sound, a silence that spoke volumes of things he did not understand, a silence that seemed to be filled with the whispers of forgotten gods. He looked up, and the sheer scale of the obelisk made him feel like a speck of dust in the face of some ancient and terrifying god, a testament to the power and magnitude of the unknown, a reminder of his own insignificance. The black surface was covered with intricate carvings, symbols he had never seen before, yet they felt oddly familiar, as though they were buried deep within his memory, waiting to be awakened, an ancient language written in the very fabric of reality. The symbols pulsed with a faint light, mirroring the orb in the chamber, as if they were connected by an invisible thread. He reached out and touched the cool, smooth surface of the monolith, the stone feeling like polished obsidian, the strange coldness of it a deep contrast to the heat he had felt on his journey, a sensation that felt both repulsive and alluring. The instant his fingers made contact, his mind was flooded with images, an overwhelming torrent of sensations and visions, a chaotic jumble of thoughts and emotions that threatened to overwhelm him, to shatter his sanity. He saw worlds being born and destroyed, civilizations rising and falling like sandcastles before the tide. The ebb and flow of time itself, the birth and death of universes, all playing out before his eyes like a grotesque pantomime. He felt 1,000 lifetimes in a single moment, all crashing down on him at once. A torrent of experiences that left him breathless and broken. He saw himself as both a player and a witness, a pawn in a game he didn't understand. He saw the origin of the orb, a sentient entity from a dimension beyond human comprehension, a being of pure energy and unimaginable power, an ancient force that had existed since the dawn of time, a creature that was both beautiful and terrifying. He saw that the lighthouse was not just a warning to sailors, but a beacon, a key to a passage between worlds, a place where the veils between realities were thin and permeable, a conduit through which this entity could exert its influence. He saw his own life, the past, the present, and the future, all unfolding simultaneously, a tapestry of moments interwoven with the threads of destiny, a story that had been written long before he was even born. He saw himself not as the master of his own fate, but as a mere instrument of this entity, a tool in its ancient plan. And he saw, too, that the orb and this monolith were not just ancient, but living. They were entities in and of themselves, with a purpose and a will of their own, forces of nature that could not be controlled. They were the keys to a door he did not know how to close. The vision subsided, leaving him breathless and shaken. His mind fragmented and his soul weary, and he was left with a sense of cold dread, a despair that seemed to consume him from the inside, and a knowledge that shattered his perception of reality, leaving him with nothing but the certainty of his own doom. He understood now the purpose of the key, the box, the door, the orb, and the monolith. And he understood that he was now irrevocably bound to this place, a prisoner of destiny, a pawn in a cosmic game, a guardian of a gate he had never asked to open. The burden of it all threatened to crush him, but he found a strange, unsettling peace in the truth, a resignation that was both terrifying and liberating. He was no longer Silas, the lighthouse keeper. He was something else, something more, and he would never be the same again. He was a conduit, a guardian, a jailer, tasked with maintaining the delicate balance between the human world and the realm beyond, a responsibility he could never escape. He felt an ancient power coursing through him, a force that was both terrifying and exhilarating, a responsibility he could not shirk, a curse he would carry for eternity. He began his duty, a role he didn't quite understand, but one he was compelled to complete, his body moving of its own accord. He had to continue to maintain the beacon, for if he did not, the pathway between worlds would become unstable, and the entity would be able to manifest itself in the Earth's plane, bringing chaos and destruction, unleashing horrors that would make the worst nightmares pale in comparison. He had to ensure that the door in the lighthouse remained intact, a seal against the darkness that lurked beyond, a barrier that protected the world from unspeakable terrors. He would become its custodian, its sentinel, its prisoner. He walked up to the structure, and a dark doorway appeared before him, a gaping maw in the obsidian stone, leading to a spiraling staircase, seemingly constructed from the same dark stone as the monolith, a staircase that seemed to descend into the very heart of the earth. The stone seemed to pulsate with the same rhythm as the orb, the drumbeat echoing in his mind, and the deeper he went, the more he felt like he was being drawn further from his old life and further into his new one, a descent into madness. He began his ascent, his footsteps echoing in the darkness, his mind filled with thoughts he did not understand, yet knew to be true, a knowledge that was both a blessing and a curse. There was no turning back, no escape from the task that awaited him. He was now bound to this place, for eternity, a prisoner of his own destiny, a guardian of the gate. Back in the lighthouse on the coast of Scotland, the lamp continued to rotate, its unwavering beam cutting through the darkness, warning ships of the rocky shores, a constant guardian of the sea, a lonely sentinel in the vast emptiness of the night. But those who watched the beam closely, those who knew what to look for, might notice that it was no longer a solid white light. Sometimes, on the darkest nights, it might flicker a strange violet hue, a subtle shift in color that hinted at something more, a glimpse of the darkness that lay beyond the veil. Sometimes it might cut an unusual pattern across the darkness, an intricate design that seemed to defy the laws of physics, the beam bending and twisting in unnatural ways, as if the light itself were being controlled by an unseen force. And sometimes, on the calmest nights, when the sea was still and the air was quiet, if they listened carefully, they might hear a low, rhythmic thumping, a persistent beat, carried on the sea breeze, a sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, a sound that spoke of ancient power and unspeakable horror. The new lighthouse keeper, Arthur, arrived on the 22nd of August, 1978, a young man eager to start his life, unaware of the darkness that awaited him. He had been told the old lighthouse keeper had disappeared without a trace, vanished into thin air, as if the sea itself had swallowed him whole, and that the search was now called off, deemed hopeless. He was given a set of keys, the official logbook, and instructions to keep the lighthouse active, to ensure the lamp continued to shine, to guide lost ships away from the treacherous rocks. They also gave him the old logbooks, which he pored over out of idle curiosity, hoping to find some clue to the old keeper's disappearance. The old keeper, Silas, had been a mysterious man, a recluse who had lived a solitary life for decades. He saw, on the 21st of June, 1963, Silas had written a box. On the beach, the color of a bruise, like a wound in the night. He flicked through the pages, and he noticed the handwriting become shakier over time, the penmanship reflecting the growing turmoil in the old man's mind. And on the 16th of July, a door, the tower, the key, the rhythm, a heartbeat that echoes in the darkness. And then on the 17th of July, a single word written in large shaky letters, the pen seemingly dragged across the page, obligated, bound by a force I cannot understand. He felt unnerved by those words, a sense of unease creeping into his bones, a feeling that he had stumbled upon a secret that was never meant to be uncovered. As he looked through the log, he saw entries that didn't quite make sense, notes that seemed out of order, his mind grasping for some meaning, some logic in the madness, numbers without context, symbols in the margins of the pages, and an increase in the strange noises Silas had been noting over the past few years, sounds he couldn't explain, echoes of a forgotten language that seemed to resonate in the very structure of the lighthouse. He tried to rationalize it, to tell himself that the old man was insane, that the solitude had driven him mad, but a part of him knew that there was something more, something dark and terrifying that lay beneath the surface. He decided to ignore the weirdness, attributing it to the solitude that had probably driven the old man insane, and he decided to carry on with his own duties, trying to forget about the strange entries, trying to convince himself that it was all just the imaginings of an old man. But he felt uneasy. He couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was not quite right, a sense of dread that seemed to seep into the very bones of the lighthouse. The lighthouse wasn't quite as he had been told. Something felt off about the place, an unexplainable sense of wrongness. The walls seemed colder than they should. The air was thick with a silence that seemed to press in on him, and the sounds of the sea seemed louder, more violent, the waves crashing against the rocks with a fury that seemed almost personal, as if they were trying to tear down the very structure of the lighthouse. The light from the lamp seemed darker than it should, a weaker beam than he would have expected, especially on the darkest of nights, a flicker of darkness in the light, a warning that he couldn't ignore. And sometimes, when the wind was just right, he could have sworn he could hear a faint, rhythmic thumping, a low and persistent beat, coming from deep within the tower, a sound that made his teeth itch and his skin crawl, a heartbeat that seemed to be calling to him from the void. He tried to ignore it, to tell himself that it was just the wind, or the old structure groaning beneath the weight of time, but he knew deep down that it was something more, something that was waiting for him. One night on the 3rd of October, 1999, just after midnight, as he was doing his rounds, checking the lamp and ensuring everything was as it should be, his heart pounding in his chest, he noticed that the lamp room felt colder than it should, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into his bones, a coldness that felt like the touch of death itself. He looked around for an explanation, his mind grasping for something rational, a logical explanation for the unnatural phenomenon, and his eyes fell upon a section of the wall he didn't remember seeing before, a section that seemed different to the rest of the wall, as though it was somehow out of place, a glitch in the reality of the lighthouse itself. A doorway, made of dark, polished wood, the same dark wood as the old man had written about, with no latch or handle, just a single keyhole, a dark and silent invitation, a gateway to a realm beyond his understanding. It seemed to beckon to him. He had never seen it before, not in all his time at the lighthouse, his memory serving as testament to its sudden appearance. Nor could he recall how he'd missed it, considering he had spent several weeks cleaning the lighthouse and getting it ready for his arrival. He knew the lighthouse like the back of his hand, and this door should not be there. A shiver ran down his spine, a cold, creeping dread that seemed to settle in the pit of his stomach, a feeling of unease that was deeper than fear. And in his pocket, tucked away, he felt something solid, something heavy. A key. He pulled it out, the metal cool against his palm, and stared at the intricate design, his brow furrowing as he tried to recall where he had found it, the glyphs on it seeming to writhe as he stared at them, taunting him with their hidden meaning. He'd never seen it before, but it felt familiar, as though he had known it for 1,000 years, a piece of him that had been missing, a memory that he could not quite grasp. He tried it in the lock, his fingers trembling slightly, a sense of inevitability washing over him, and with a click, a sound that echoed in the oppressive silence of the night, the door opened. A gust of cold, stale air rushed out, a smell of dust and something alien, like decayed leather and ozone, an acrid stench that made his eyes water, the smell of a forgotten world. And an odd, low, rhythmic thumping began, a familiar beat that vibrated in his bones, the heartbeat of the darkness that lay beyond. He was about to enter, drawn by an invisible force, his body moving of its own accord, when he heard something behind him, a sound that was almost imperceptible, a whisper in the darkness. He turned around, his heart pounding in his chest, fear mixing with an unexplainable sense of recognition, to see Silas, the old lighthouse keeper, standing in the doorway, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow, staring at him with a desperate intensity, a silent plea for him to turn away. He was gaunt, his skin stretched taut over his bones, his hair long and unkempt, tangled and matted, and his clothes were tattered and worn, as if he had been wandering in the wilderness for years, a living ghost. He looked like a shell of his former self. "Don't," he said, his voice low and raspy, almost a whisper. Yet it echoed in the stillness, as if carried on the wind from a distant shore. "Don't go in there. It's a prison, not a passage." But Arthur couldn't seem to hear him, his ears filled with the relentless thumping, the hypnotic rhythm that seemed to call to him. His gaze was fixed on the doorway, unable to look away, the darkness beckoning to him with an irresistible allure. He was like a moth drawn to a flame, unable to resist the pull, a prisoner of his own destiny. His hand reached out, pushed through the door, and he stepped through, disappearing into the darkness beyond, the darkness swallowing him whole. Silas watched him, his face etched with a mixture of despair and resignation, his eyes empty of all hope, as the door closed behind him, sealing Arthur's fate, condemning him to the same eternal torment. He sighed, a deep, weary sigh that seemed to carry the weight of centuries, the weight of his own eternal obligation. Then he walked back to his post, his movements slow and deliberate, his body numb with weariness, but his duty a constant flame that burned within him. He had to ensure that the beacon remained strong, that it continued to warn ships of the dangers of the coast, that it held the darkness at bay. He had to ensure that the delicate balance was maintained, that the darkness was kept at bay, even if it cost him his own soul. He continued, alone, his eternal watch, in the desolate landscape, bound by the chains of destiny, a prisoner of his own obligations, his only companion the echo of the drumbeat and the ghosts of the lighthouse. Obligated. The cycle continues. The antique clock in the attic of Blackwood Manor chimed 13 times on the night of the 3rd of October, 1929. It wasn't the usual melodic chime of a grandfather clock, but a discordant, guttural clang, like metal scraping against bone. A sound that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the old house and sent a shard of icy dread into the heart of young Elias Blackwood, the last of his line. He was only 10 years old at the time, a fragile boy, orphaned and left alone in the vast, decaying estate by the sudden, horrific passing of his parents just weeks before, their lives abruptly extinguished by a mysterious illness that had swept through the countryside. The 13 chimes echoed through the silent hallways, a mocking lament, a reminder of the unnatural things that resided within Blackwood Manor, a dark heartbeat in the silence of the night. He had been told by his old tutor, Mr. Abernathy, a man with haunted eyes and a tremor in his voice, that the clock hadn't chimed for centuries, that it was a silent sentinel, a relic of a long-forgotten time, a dormant beast waiting for its awakening. Now, its brazen chimes felt like a malevolent awakening, a call to something dark that had been sleeping for far too long. Elias had been exploring the dusty attic, a cavernous space filled with forgotten relics of his family's past, trying to find some solace in the tangible remnants of their existence, seeking a connection to those he had lost. He had hoped that the familiarity of the objects, the scent of old paper and dried flowers, might somehow bring back the echoes of their laughter, the warmth of their presence. Instead, he had stumbled upon something far more unsettling, something that had been waiting for him for generations. It was not the ornate grandfather clock in the corner that had startled him, its face obscured by shadows and dust. It was a small, leather-bound journal, tucked away in the bottom of a heavy, iron-banded chest, its lock rusted and broken, as if someone had tried to force it open. The leather was cracked and worn, smelling of mildew and decay, and the pages within were brittle with age, filled with a spidery script and strange, disturbing drawings, unlike anything he had ever seen before, images that seemed to writhe and shift before his very eyes. The journal, written in a frenzied scrawl by his great-great-grandfather, Silas Blackwood, spoke of strange, unholy rituals, of a pact made with something that dwelled beyond the veil, an entity of immense, incomprehensible power that demanded absolute obedience, a being that existed outside the boundaries of human comprehension. Silas wrote of a hidden chamber beneath the manor, a place where the very laws of nature were subverted, where reality twisted and warped, a place of dark magic and unspeakable horror, a gateway to a dimension where nightmares were made real. He described the entity as a creature of pure shadow, a being that existed outside of time, waiting patiently for its return, a hunger that could never be satisfied. Silas had written that the only thing preventing its emergence into the world of man was a series of intricate rituals that needed to be completed every 7 years, and that the clock was a tool in those rituals, its 13 chimes marking a passage of time within the realms beyond, each chime a step closer to the entity's release. He also wrote of the 13th chime as a warning, a signal that the entity was growing restless, its power growing with each passing year, its hunger becoming insatiable. Elias, though young, was not a fool. He had a deep and quiet intellect that belied his years. The story was strange, unsettling, bordering on madness, but the journal felt old, heavy with a kind of dark, undeniable power, a truth that resonated within his bones, a certainty that this was not merely the ramblings of a madman. He spent the next few days consumed by its contents, poring over the cryptic words and the disturbing drawings, trying to make sense of his great-great-grandfather's descent into madness, trying to decipher the secrets hidden within the old house, trying to understand his family's curse. He discovered that the strange, glyph-like symbols drawn on the pages were also etched on the face of the grandfather clock, their lines seeming to shift and writhe under his gaze, and also scattered throughout the manor itself, hidden in plain sight, as if the house itself was a living, breathing entity. He found them carved into the stone of the fireplace, their lines warped and twisted beneath the old, threadbare rugs, their patterns subtly changed by the dark energy, and even in the patterns of the wallpaper, their floral designs subtly forming the shapes of screaming faces, each one a silent sentinel guarding a dark truth, a reminder that the house was watching, listening. Then, on the night of the 12th of December 1936, at precisely 3 minutes after 11 p.m., as the moon cast long, skeletal shadows across the grounds, he heard it. The same discordant, guttural clang of the antique clock, 13 chimes that echoed through the manor, their sound more intense, more menacing than he remembered, chilling him to the bone. A sign that the ritual was about to begin anew, that the entity was about to be roused again from its slumber, its dark influence spreading like a disease. Elias was now 17, no longer a child, but the terror he felt was just as profound, perhaps even more so, as he knew the true nature of the horror he faced. He had long been trying to piece together the journal's secrets, a puzzle that seemed to shift and change with every passing day, and now he knew that he would soon have to face the truth behind his family's dark legacy, a fate that had been written for him long before he was even born. The attic seemed darker that night, the air thicker, the shadows deeper and more menacing, as if they were alive and reaching for him, whispering his name in a language he did not understand. He knew that the key to understanding the rituals lay hidden somewhere within the manor, the house itself a living puzzle, a complex labyrinth designed to test his resolve. The journal spoke of a series of clues, scattered throughout the house, each one a step further into the depths of madness, each leading to the next, a twisted treasure hunt designed to bind the next generation to the family's pact, to ensure their eternal servitude. Elias followed the clues, his heart pounding in his chest with each step, the silence of the manor amplifying his every move, making him feel like he was being watched, his every breath a sound that could trigger the entity's wrath. The first clue was hidden behind the portrait of his great-great-grandfather, a man with eyes that seemed to follow him even in the darkness, a small brass key, intricately carved with the same strange, writhing symbols as the clock and the journal, its metal warm to the touch, as if it had been held in a hand not of this world. The key unlocked a hidden compartment in an old bookshelf, revealing a second journal, its leather a shade darker, the pages filled with a sense of growing despair. This one written by Silas's son, Bartholomew. Bartholomew's journal spoke of a different entity, one that had been awakened by his father's recklessness, a consequence of his hubris, a creature born of chaos, a being that craved not obedience, but destruction, a force that sought to tear the very fabric of reality. Bartholomew wrote that his father's ritual had gone horribly wrong, that he had failed to contain the shadow, and that now a second entity was growing in power beneath the manor, its presence like a festering wound, its influence corrupting everything it touched. He described this entity as a swirling vortex of darkness, a void that threatened to consume everything, a hunger that could not be satisfied. Bartholomew's journal ended abruptly, in mid-sentence, with a note of despair describing his growing madness, his mind becoming fragmented, and his impending death at the hands of whatever creature he had unleashed. His last words a frantic scream that echoed through the ages. Elias found more clues hidden in old musical instruments, their strings broken, their keys warped, each note they made a distorted mockery of melody, in forgotten books of alchemy, their pages filled with bizarre diagrams and cryptic formulas, and in the cold stone basement beneath the manor, where the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay, a place where shadows danced and writhed with a life of their own. Each clue brought him closer to the truth, and each clue filled him with a growing sense of dread, a feeling that he was being pulled deeper into a nightmare from which he would never awaken. He realized that the house itself was not merely a structure, but a part of the ritual, a complex machine designed to contain the entities, each room a component of a complex lock, each object a piece of a macabre puzzle. The third journal, hidden in the old, dry well in the garden, a place where the ground seemed to writhe and shift beneath his feet, was written by Elias's grandfather, Caleb, a man whose handwriting was as broken as his soul. Caleb's journal spoke of a desperate attempt to repair the damage done by Silas, an effort to seal away the chaos that Bartholomew had unleashed, a futile attempt to restore the balance that had been lost, a hope that had been extinguished long ago. He described a counter-ritual, a series of steps designed to appease the entities, to restore the balance that had been lost, to save his family from their terrible fate. But he had failed, his life's work a wasted effort. The journals were a maddening puzzle, each one contradicting the others, each one revealing a different piece of the horrible truth, a labyrinth of madness with no escape, an echo of pain and despair through time. It was as if Elias was trapped within a never-ending nightmare, each turn bringing him closer to a fate he couldn't possibly imagine, his sanity eroding with each step. He felt the weight of his family's dark legacy pressing down on him, the weight of centuries of madness and despair, and he knew that he had to stop it, or else the entities would break free, and his world would be consumed by darkness. His very existence would become nothing more than a memory in the void. Then, on the 28th of February 1943, at precisely 2 minutes after 5 a.m., as the sky was beginning to bleed with the colors of dawn, the old house began to tremble, its very foundations shaking as if a great beast was awakening beneath its surface. The clock chimed 13 times again, its discordant, bone-jarring clang echoing through the manor, a warning of the impending chaos, a signal that the veil between worlds was thinning. Elias, now 24 years old, was ready, or as ready as one could be to face the unknown. His heart filled with a mixture of terror and a grim resolve. He had pieced together the clues, his mind racing to connect the fragmented pieces of his family's terrible story. He had deciphered the symbols, each line an echo of pain and madness. He had studied the rituals, his hands trembling as he pored over the cryptic texts, and now he had to perform them, whether he wanted to or not, his fate sealed by the actions of his ancestors. He knew that the ritual required the sacrifice of something precious, something that held a piece of his soul, a piece of his humanity. He descended into the cold, dark basement, his footsteps echoing in the silence, following the instructions in his grandfather's journal, his body trembling with cold and dread. The basement was a labyrinth of stone passages and damp, earthy chambers, the air thick with the scent of mildew and decay, a place where the veil was thin, where shadows danced and writhed of their own accord, where whispers echoed from other worlds. He found a hidden staircase, concealed behind a loose stone, its steps worn and uneven, that led deeper still, into a chamber that was not of this world, a place that seemed to defy the very laws of nature. The chamber was circular, its walls made of a black, obsidian-like stone that seemed to absorb all light, creating an oppressive darkness, the only illumination coming from a pulsating, violet orb in the center of the room, its light casting strange, distorted shadows across the walls, making the space seem to shift and writhe before his very eyes. The orb seemed to throb with a life of its own, its light pulsing with a dark energy, its surface rippling like the surface of a disturbed pond, a reflection of a chaotic dimension beyond human comprehension. The room hummed with a low, resonant frequency, a vibration that seemed to penetrate his very bones, resonating deep within his soul, awakening something ancient and terrible. As Elias stepped into the chamber, his heart pounding in his chest like a trapped bird, the orb pulsed brighter, its light becoming a blinding intensity, and the air grew colder, as if the very heat was being drawn from the room. The low hum increased in intensity, the vibration becoming almost unbearable, and the floor began to vibrate, the very ground beneath his feet seeming to shift and move, and Elias felt himself pulled towards the orb, as though drawn by an invisible force, a magnetic pull that he could not resist, his body moving against his will. He fought the pull, his legs trembling with the effort, his mind screaming in terror, but the force was too strong, an ancient power that had been waiting for this moment. The journal said that he had to sacrifice something precious to appease the entities, to buy himself some time, a temporary reprieve from the inevitable. In his hand, clutched tightly as if it were a lifeline, he held an old locket that he had found in his mother's room, a small silver heart, its surface scratched and worn, that contained a picture of her and his father, the only memento he had left of them, a reminder of the love and warmth that had been taken from him. With a heavy heart, his eyes filled with tears, he dropped the locket into the orb, its silver metal disappearing as if swallowed by the darkness, and a blinding light erupted, filling the chamber with its intensity, a light that seemed to burn his very soul. When the light faded, the orb was gone, its dark energy extinguished, and the chamber had changed, the black stone seeming to soften and ripple, the very space twisting and distorting around him. The walls were no longer made of black stone, but of mirrors, an infinite array, each one reflecting a distorted version of himself, his face contorted with fear and despair. In each mirror, he could see a different version of the manor, each one more twisted and terrifying than the last, a multiverse of possibilities, a nightmare made real. He saw the manor crumbling to dust, its walls collapsing and falling into a void, the manor consumed by fire, its flames reaching for the heavens, the manor overtaken by the darkness, its halls filled with the whispers of forgotten horrors, and the manor filled with strange, shadowy figures, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light, each version a horrifying vision of the future that awaited him, the terrible fate that he was trying so desperately to avoid. He realized that the chamber was not simply a space, but a nexus of possibilities, a crossroads of time, a prison of his own making. He had become trapped within a vortex of his own making, a prisoner of his own family's dark legacy. He stumbled back from the mirrors, his mind reeling from the visions, each one a shard of a broken reality, and he found another passage, concealed behind one of the reflections, a doorway that seemed to shift and change as he watched it, a path leading him further into the heart of the manor's dark secrets, a journey from which he knew he would never return. He followed it, his body moving as if controlled by some unseen puppet master, and the passage twisted and turned, defying the very laws of geometry, leading him to a series of rooms he had never seen before, each one more bizarre and terrifying than the last, each one a descent further into the abyss. He found rooms filled with living plants that seemed to writhe and twist of their own accord, their leaves sprouting eyes that watched him with a malevolent intensity, rooms where the air shimmered and distorted, where gravity seemed to lose its meaning, and rooms that seemed to shift and change as he looked at them, their walls rearranging themselves into impossible geometries. Time itself seemed to have no meaning in this place. The boundaries of reality blurred, and Elias began to doubt his own sanity, questioning if what he was seeing was truly real, or just a figment of his imagination. He finally arrived at a large open chamber, the air thick with the scent of blood and decay, in the center of which stood an enormous, pulsating black heart, suspended in midair, a grotesque parody of life. It was the source of the thumping, the same beat that had echoed throughout the manor for centuries, the dark heart of the entities, the core of his family's curse, a living, breathing wound in the fabric of reality. He realized that his family was not simply bound to the pact. They had become the pact itself, their blood and their souls forever intertwined with the entities, their very existence a sacrifice to the darkness. The black heart began to throb faster, its rhythm echoing in his skull, and the walls of the chamber began to dissolve, the stone melting away like candle wax, and Elias found himself in a vast, empty void, a place where the very concepts of time and space had ceased to exist, a realm beyond human comprehension, where the laws of physics had been broken and the boundaries of reality had shattered into nothingness. He saw the two entities, not as creatures, but as forces, as fundamental aspects of the universe itself, eternal and unchanging, embodiments of chaos and order, light and darkness. The shadow, a swirling vortex of darkness, a hunger that could never be satisfied, and the chaos, a destructive force that sought to tear everything apart, a desire to remake the universe in its own image. They were both parts of the same whole, two sides of the same coin, locked in an eternal struggle that had been raging since the beginning of time, a battle that had spread to his family, to his home, to him. They were not simply beneath the manor. They were the manor itself. They were the very foundation upon which it was built, their dark energy permeating every stone, every shadow, every corner of the house. The manor was not a house, but a prison, a cage designed to contain them, and his family had been their wardens for generations, bound to an eternal cycle of ritual and sacrifice, a cycle that he was now a part of. He was not sure how long he had been there. Time had become meaningless, his mind a jumble of fragmented thoughts and terrifying visions, but he found himself back in the chamber with the mirrors, the black heart now silent, the pulsating orb gone, the room a barren wasteland, stripped of all its power. He saw his reflection, and he saw that he had changed. He was no longer the young, hopeful boy who had first entered this place, the innocent child who had once dreamed of a normal life. He was no longer Elias Blackwood, the orphaned boy, but something else, something more, something less than human, a creature that had been born from the darkness. His eyes glowed with a faint violet light, their gaze cold and distant, and his skin had become pale and translucent, as if he were made of moonlight and shadows, a being that belonged to both this world and another. He knew now that he was bound to this place, just like his ancestors before him. His fate sealed the moment he was born into the Blackwood lineage. He was no longer a free man. He was now the guardian of Blackwood Manor, the warden of the entities, the puppet of his family's dark legacy, a prisoner of his own destiny, his soul forever bound to the darkness. He stepped back out of the basement, his body moving as if controlled by some unseen force, the house above him silent, waiting, its dark heart beating with the pulse of the entities. On the 18th of August, 1964, a group of local children, their minds filled with foolish bravado, dared each other to trespass onto the grounds of Blackwood Manor, the old house looming before them like a skeletal finger pointing to the sky, a monument to a forgotten terror. It was a place the locals avoided, a cursed place that was whispered about in hushed tones, a place where death and madness had taken root and grown. The children, however, young and foolish, blinded by their own sense of invincibility, didn't believe in such things. They thought it was just a silly tale to frighten children. They found the front door unlocked, a silent invitation, and they ventured inside, their curiosity overriding their fear, eager to see what lay within the abandoned manor, their laughter echoing through the halls, soon to be silenced by the truth. They explored the dusty hallways and the decaying rooms, their footsteps echoing in the silence, and they found an old clock in the attic, its face obscured by shadows and cobwebs, a relic of a forgotten time. One of the children, a young boy named Thomas, his face filled with a mixture of awe and fear, reached out and touched the clock, his fingers brushing against its cold surface. It chimed 13 times, its discordant clang echoing through the silent house, a sound that seemed to reverberate in their very bones, a haunting melody that marked the beginning of the end. He looked up at his friends, bewildered, his eyes wide with terror. What was it that he had just heard? What was the strange sound that had just pierced the silence? What terrible secret was hidden beneath the surface of this place? And deep within the manor, Elias, the new warden, smiled, a cold, empty smile, his eyes glowing with the same violet light that marked his transformation. The cycle had begun again. The terrible curse of the Blackwoods had continued. He was not alone. There would be others. He knew that the manor could not be destroyed, that it could not be escaped. It was a prison and it was a home, a place that was both familiar and terrifying, a nexus between worlds that could never be broken. He knew that one day, another would come, another child drawn to the darkness, another foolhardy soul who would find the key to the puzzle, another guardian who would be bound to the manor's eternal cycle, that the entities would never be truly contained, and that his family's dark legacy would continue to haunt Blackwood Manor forever, that the horror would never truly end. He was the warden, the prisoner, and the bait, and somewhere, in the darkness, the entities waited, patient, hungry, their dreams of escape growing ever stronger, and their influence spreading to other corners of the earth. The clock ticked on, marking the passage of time. The curse continued. The cycle would repeat.